Good morning, everybody. I suppose you all had a good time last night in Barcelona. Lovely city. And then you woke up and had breakfast and had to talk about Tuskegee, of all things. That was not such a nice occasion. Well, we'll expand on that a little this morning. But first we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it necessary to assess medical research involving human subjects? Why do we have to do that? After all, we know that we need that kind of research very much. It's part of our human project to increase happiness and well-being. So, should we then encourage that kind of research instead of hampering it with all kinds of regulations and instruments to control it? Do we have sufficient reason to have so many scruples? What harm could possibly be done by it? Medical research, after all, brings knowledge, new knowledge to doctors and scientists, and patients participating in trials directly benefit from the latest state-of-the-art treatments. Isn't that a win-win situation? Who could possibly be against that? Well, as you've seen from the Tuskegee experiment, unfortunately, the history of medical trials teaches us that it's not always a win-win situation. Actually, sometimes terrible things have been done to participants in medical trials. And history shows us that trial designs may be faulty. They may damage the participants. And history also shows us that not everybody involved in trials can be trusted at face value. Now, some examples to illustrate this. This fellow you see here, on top left, where is my pointer? Well, you can see him. The one in the uniform, that's Walter Reed. And he was a US Army physician. He lived around 1900. And the US government sent him to Cuba, to the army camp Lazar, to carry out some experiments. Because at that time, and you see that on the left-hand bottom picture, the United States were digging the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal was very important to bring the fleet to the Pacific Ocean. So they wanted this canal to be completed as soon as possible. But what was the point? The point was that the labor force caught yellow fever. About half of the laborers caught yellow fever, and many of them died. And that hampered the building of the canal. So something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. Now, Walter Reed was sent in, and he was told to solve the problem. And what did he do? Well, let's first hear his own words. He said, "I thank God that I didn't accept anybody's opinion on this subject, but determined to put it to a thorough test with human beings in order to see what would happen. And actual trials have proven that I'm right." Now, the trials he was mentioning involved this setup. He took 2 wooden cabins, and he took 2 groups of volunteers, soldiers. And the first group was put in one cabin, which was soiled with the excrements of yellow fever patients, and they were to wear the clothes of these patients and to sleep in their beds. And the other group got clean clothes, was put in a clean cabin, but that cabin contained gnats. They were flying everywhere around in that cabin. Now, of course, we know what happened. The ones in the soiled cabin stayed healthy, but the ones in the clean cabin were stung by the gnats, and they caught yellow fever. And thus it was proven that it were the gnats that brought yellow fever to human beings. Now, nowadays we would say this trial is a faulty trial. Why? Why is it faulty? What's wrong with it? There. The microphone.
You're going to risk the health of some people just to find out what the difference is.
That's right. So, the informed consent was given. They were volunteers. But the risks were so high. It was possible that people would die. They were very lucky because the people who fell ill, none of them died. But that was just a coincidence. So, we would say that's impossible. You can't ask that from anyone, to take the risk to die just to prove a concept. Now, Now we could say Walter Reed lived more than 100 years ago, so why worry? We know now that we wouldn't take those kinds of risks nowadays. We know better now, so why worry? But then you read about the Tuskegee incident. That was 30 years later on. And, well, we won't go into details anymore because you can read them on the slide and you've talked about it. It was horrible. And why was it horrible? Which principles were not complied with there? Anybody have a suggestion? What were all the wrongs being done by the researchers there? Not so easy to formulate that, is it? Well, first of all, the participants never were able to give informed consent because they weren't even told they were enrolled in a trial. And then again, as soon as there was a treatment for syphilis on the market, it was withheld from them. So there was a withholding of the standard treatment. That's the second principle. And then advantage was taken of a vulnerable population because most of those sharecroppers couldn't even read. As one in our small group session this morning said, it's not only that they were not well informed, they were misinformed. They were told they had bad blood. They were never told they had syphilis. They were never told there was penicillin on the market. They were never told that they were withheld from military draft because then they would have a military checkup from their health and then it would be clear that they had syphilis. So they were misinformed and they were told, you'll get free medical care. That's the only thing that was said to them just to pull them into this trial. And to worsen matters, the protocol was virtually non-existent. And it was seriously flawed, so nothing was learned from these 40 years of mistreating these people. Now, then again we can say, well, that's 60 years. Well, okay, 1972 is 50 years ago. Why worry? We've learned from that. Well, what about this? It's my own country. Only 7 years ago. Public opinion in Holland was shocked 7 years ago to hear the outcome of a seemingly innocent trial involving the use of probiotics. In that study, patients suffering from severe pancreatitis were given probiotics as a prophylactic, whereas patients in the control group received placebo. Now, in the end, it turned out that in the group that received the study medication, 24 out of 152 participants died, whereas only 9 out of the control group of 144. There was a significant difference in mortality. And there was a so-called Data Safety Monitoring Committee. It should have seen this halfway the trial. But the data were withheld from the committee. They were transferred too late when the damage had already been done. And afterwards, a thorough inspection by our health authorities revealed that this trial suffered from an inadequate study design from the beginning. Mistake after mistake was being made. The investigators who designed the trial had a faulty protocol. The firm that produced the biotics made mistakes. The Research Ethics Committee had been asleep. And also, say some, the Data Safety Monitoring Committee. And as if all these failures weren't yet enough, after publication of all this information in the press, some of the participants came forward and said, we didn't even know we were enrolled in a trial. We never gave informed consent. Now, a lot of this is still being debated, because many people say the Data Safety Monitoring Committee never made a mistake, and some people say that also the participants were all very well informed. That's a debate that's still raging, but this is only 7 years ago in our own country, the Netherlands, people dying because they took part in a trial. Now, yesterday Marco told you about the T. Janeiro problems, or it was on Monday, I think. So we're also entering some areas of medicine in which we encounter more and more black boxes. So this can happen. The more it's very important that people know what they're going into, what they're saying yes to. And then, as someone in our small group session this morning commented correctly, how about 2015? We are not so sure that all these things cannot happen today in the so-called underdeveloped countries, and that's true. Many, many trials are being transported to the underdeveloped countries. Why? Why do you think they do that? Why do companies go there? It's easy, but why it's easy? Less regulations, of course, but even if they're there, then still. Could you use the microphone, please?
Patients are desperate. There's no funding for drugs, and they depend on this.
That's right. The standard of care there is no care at all. So you have a nice placebo to compare to. And especially India is a great market at this moment. You can see there a picture from India. But we should ask ourselves if it's correct to put such a burden on a very vulnerable population, whereas the results of this burden, of these trials, are only to the profit of the Western world. Because very often, this medication is not available after the trial has stopped in the particular countries the trials are conducted in. So, regulations and laws are very necessary on this point, and I must say there's a lot more to be told about this, because many of the countries in which these trials are being conducted themselves say, well, let them come. At least something is being done. And if we learn from the mistakes we make, we might also in our countries get it right. So it's not just a simple bad guys against good guys, or we should stop this and do this, don't do this, but we should think through what we are doing when we bring these trials to these countries. 2015, and it's an enormous amount of trials being conducted there. It's not just one or two, it's tens or hundreds. Okay, well, I'm starting my lecture with these examples because I want to show you that the things we are going to talk about this hour are not historical or philosophical and therefore only theoretical issues. They're issues that are very important now, today, in our lives, in the things we want to do and realize. So, let's take a closer look at the kind of medical research we are talking about today. What's so special about that kind of research? Now let's take the Declaration of Helsinki as a starting point, and we come to the declaration further on, then I'll explain what it is. It states at the outset that the primary purpose of medical research involving human subjects is to improve prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic procedures and the understanding of the etiology and pathogenesis of disease. But this can be said of all other kinds of medical research also. You could, for example, study medical files and draw conclusions from the data contained. Or you could examine human tissue or rest material that was left over from surgery, or that was gathered in the course of an investigation or a treatment of a patient. And most of that kind of research is not submitted to the judgment of an ethical committee. Why do we do that with research involving human beings? What makes medical research involving human subjects such a special category? It is the fact that this type of research always subjects human beings to specific treatments or dictates rules of conduct to them. Simply said, we are doing all sorts of things to people. Now, what are we allowed to do to our fellow men in the name of progress of science? The examples we discussed show us a number of things we wouldn't want people to endure or to undergo. So the question is, how much can we reasonably ask of a subject or a group of subjects to endure, to undergo, to help us all take a step forward in our struggle against disease and untimely death? That is, ethically spoken, the heart of the matter. And it's a very serious question. We're talking about the well-being of our fellow human beings here. Therefore, we need to discuss it constantly, and therefore we need to regulate this kind of research. Now, let's examine this discussion by considering the development of the assessment of medical research. For nowadays, to most of us, it seems self-evident that a randomized controlled trial is the only valid way to conduct research. But there were times that wasn't so self-evident at all. So I'm going to take you on a short and concise course of the history of medical research. 4 eras we will travel through, and this is the first one, the philosophical era. Doctrine dictates the development of medicine. This era is the era from antiquity up to the Renaissance, or even some people say to the 16th century. Clinical practice is less important than the theory, because medicine is part of a larger philosophical or theological system. And the system is based on the work of the Greek physician Galen. For many centuries, that dictates what a physician is allowed to think and allowed to do. And central to that thinking of Galen is Hippocrates' theory that the human body is filled with 4 bodily fluids, humors, called phlegms. Phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these juices represents a certain temperament, and imbalance in the quantities of one or more would cause disease and other disorders. And such a lack of balance is then treated by means of a diet or bloodletting. And only in the 16th century, an interest in observation and experiments comes up. And that immediately leads to conflicts with authorities. Anatomical discoveries, the discovery of the circulatory system, for example, William Harvey in 1620. It takes a long time before they convince the medical world, and they bring the discovering scientists immediately in conflict with the prevailing morality and doctrine, and the church, of course, which is very dominant in those ages. However, even the ones who are experimenting do not experiment to treat. They only want to change theories. It's still all part of changing the theoretical paradigms. After this, that's Galen, by the way, in the middle. And he was a physician attending to gladiators in Rome. And he was the first one to see that there's a difference between blood containing oxygen and blood without oxygen, because inspecting the wounds the gladiators brought to each other, he saw that some had bright red wounds and other had dark red wounds. So that made him think. So we enter the Romantic period. And in this period, serious attempts are being made to apply knowledge that is gained in scientific experiments in clinical practice. However, the great achievements and discoveries that now are being made are ascribed to so-called geniuses, heroes of the mind. And here you find some of them: Louis Pasteur, Ignaz Semmelweis, Maria Curie. In fact, however, these achievements of these people were not just a result of sudden brain waves. That's not true. Semmelweis did, in fact, a retrospective analysis. His hypothesis was that hand washing by doctors greatly reduced the incidence of fatal puerperal fever. And he knew that in the clinic in Budapest he had worked in, the doctors washed their hands when going from one patient to another. But in Vienna, where he was working currently, they didn't do that. And mortality in Vienna was much larger than in Budapest. So he told his fellow doctors, you should wash your hands. Now, of course, he was right, but he had to leave the hospital because his colleagues didn't like him. And Louis Pasteur didn't have a hunch how to treat rabies. He meticulously followed his patients. He looked at what happened, and then he got a clue. He got an idea of what he probably might do. And Marie Curie, she experimented on herself with X-ray in such a way that even her hands at the end of her life were almost unusable. Follows the period, the era of natural science. At the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the methodical research of natural science becomes more and more the accepted standard in medical research. Experiments and observations lead to generalizations and great steps forward. But unfortunately, many of these experiments are conducted in a most irresponsible and unethical way. Researchers messed with volunteers, but also with prisoners and soldiers. Think about Walter Reed. It is quite startling that it had to be Germany, the German government, that in 1932 adopted a law that regulated experiments with humans. And voluntary participation, we would say autonomy, was at the heart of that law, 1932 in Germany. And it is a bitter twist of fate that precisely in that same Germany, only 1 year later, the regime came to power that wrote the most gruesome page in the history of medical research involving human subjects. The most horrible example of unethical experimenting is that of Nazi scientists and physicians who perpetrated atrocities on innocent people. They wanted to find solutions to medical problems, and they simply took Jewish concentration camp inmates and Russian prisoners of war to use them as test animals. Think about Josef Mengele, who used Jewish twins to conduct all kinds of gruesome experiments. Here you see Eva Kor, she's one of the survivors, and she's pointing at herself. She's holding hands with her twin sister. And in the right you see the original photograph, which was taken at the day that Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. So luckily she survived. And she founded a foundation that is now teaching school children about discrimination and all the terrible things that happened and we shouldn't do to each other. And one of the deeply moving things is that Eva Kor went back to Auschwitz to meet some of the former guards of Auschwitz, and she personally, I think I have to underline that, she personally said, I forgive you. Me personally, I forgive you. I can't forgive for all the other people. They have to decide that for themselves. But me personally, I forgive you because I want to leave it behind me. Not because of any nice principle, but I don't want to be a victim all of my life. I want to go on living. So, a very strong woman, that. Now, remember that this is also the time that the Tuskegee experiment is in full flung order. It's moving up, more and more, enrolling more and more people. So it's not just the Nazis who didn't care about subjects. All over the world, people thought, well, we can do this because it's for the progress of science. Now, when the Nazi crimes came into the open in 1945 and 46, the world, of course, was shocked. And these revelations led to reflection and to development of codes of conduct. And understandably, the first one concentrated on free choice. Here you see, well, this is interesting. It's gruesome, but interesting. Here you see SS physicians putting a POW from Russia into a basin with ice water. You know, Luftwaffe pilots were shot down over the sea, and then they went into the cold water, and they had hypothermia. And now the question was, how do you warm up a person after that? When you take him out, do you have to warm him up fast or slowly, or in what way? Now, they took POWs, put them in ice water, and out of the 300 involved, about 90 died because of these experiments. Now, the interesting question I want to pose to you is, you can see a chart on the right-hand side. That's a conclusion of the experiments. The conclusions are still being used today. And that's not only conclusions of this experiment, but many of the Nazi experiments and Japanese experiments in biochemistry and biowarfare are being used today. What do you think of that? You spoke well. What do we have to think of that? We wouldn't want to go through experiments like these again. Yes, there's one.
Okay, I don't think I'm the right person to talk about ethics, but for me that's normal, because unfortunately through the history, through the experiments that were terrible through other human beings, we got the most excellent results. And they are used today, of course. And also today, I think that all around the world, we are still doing the very wrong experiments. And we are using those results.
Yes.
For me, it's very reasonable that you cannot maybe find out some things unless you are doing it on the human being. Mm. And now it's just a question like, where is the border, where is the line?
Yes.
I really don't think that the experiments will be stopped. I mean, even in countries that are developed, you still have different off-label uses that are maybe not so correct, and so on and so on. So this still exists, but in another way.
Okay, thank you. Of course, it's impossible to answer this question in a right way. We do need. We can't throw away the knowledge we have. It's like the A-bomb. We know how to make it, and we perhaps would rather not know it, but the knowledge is there. Yeah, first that one, and then you.
I have a strange situation because my great-uncle, his lungs were damaged by the use of mustard gas in the First World War, but my husband has been taking tablets for his cancer that have been developed from mustard gas. Yeah. So all I can say is when we use these results, you have to be mindful of where they came from, but you have to use them now for good, because otherwise those people died horrendous deaths and nothing came of it. Like the Tuskegee, and nothing came of it. So, but we have to be mindful, and we have to just make sure that we don't do things like that again, I think.
Thank you, yes. And then you...
Point, and I think that's how it's done, isn't it? They just, when they use the data, they have to mention where it comes from, and it probably wouldn't hurt to every time having to quote what was wrong with how these data were collected.
So it's more or less a lesson for us for the future, but it would be gruesome to conduct those experiments again and use people. Now we know what we have to know, we can use it, being aware that the way the results were found was horrible. Yeah. Okay.
I believe that.
Okay.
Sorry.
There.
I believe
Stina.
that when we are using these results, we pay respect to the people that had to die for unrightly. And I think it would perhaps be wrong not to use the data and let them even worse die. You know,
that it would even be more senseless the way they died.
Yeah.
Yes.
So at least a little sense, very small one, but is given to this useless death.
Thank you.
I agree with this, but I hear a little thing what makes me fear there will someone in the future will be someone who says we need those experiments to get some very important information, and maybe he will use another way we won't agree with, and we won't get to know it before. So there's a fear, still the fear that things like this could happen in future.
Yeah.
Because we always use the argument, we need those information.
Yes. So there's always the danger that
Yeah.
irresponsible people
There
think
are always two sides of the
to
thing.
make a step forward,
Yeah.
well, let's bend the law, let's just look the other way. Okay, so we need to be aware. Well, thank you for that remark, because of course you understand that is the message I want to get across. Not all doctors are, like Dr. Frankenstein or whatever. That's not true at all. But sometimes people are ambitious or careless or nonchalant or whatever. And we need to be constantly aware and inform each other about what our intentions are, what we want to do. We have to be honest about what we want to do. Okay. Well, we'll continue. After the Second World War, as I said, codes of conduct came up, the Nuremberg Code, and this is very important. The way it is formulated, you will encounter again and again, so it's important to read it together. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of control, power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. Now, after World War II, medical research kept developing along this path, the path that was set by the methods of natural science, And the individual human being was seen as an example, a specific example in which we can identify laws of nature and biological mechanisms which are also at work in the group which this person belongs to. But more and more the rights of human subjects were acknowledged. After all, participants in a trial are not mere objects to work with, they are fellow human beings and their free will should be respected. But still many things went wrong. Sometimes they even went dramatically wrong. In 1961, public opinion was shocked by the thalidomide affair. The sedative thalidomide of the company Grünenthal appeared to cause serious abnormalities of the fetus in pregnant women. And something that wasn't discovered during the development of the drug. And 2,000 children died and 10,000 were severely disfigured. Now, in many countries, public opinion demanded strict laws and regulations and supervision by healthcare authorities. Now remember, the thalidomide affair had an enormous impact on public opinion because it was the first affair that was broadcast on television. So, sitting in your own room, you suddenly were confronted with what was happening out there in research laboratories and what was the result of that. That made people think. Healthcare professionals themselves also acknowledged the problem. In 1964, the Nuremberg Code was converted by the World Medical Association into the Helsinki Declaration. And it was hoped that that declaration would have wider effect because it better reflects clinical practice. The declaration provides some important guidelines for assessment of medical research. It's being constantly updated. I think the last update was from October 2013, as far as I know. Now, on the outset, it states, while the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects. That's Article 8. And that is a very important statement. It states that human beings can never be used as means to an end, however honorable that end may be. And the philosophical educated people within you will know that is a maxim of Immanuel Kant. People are always to be treated as an end, not as a means to an end. It is an important principle because it turns out our attention to the remarkable difference, and I want to underline that difference here several times this morning, the difference between the relationship between a doctor and his patient in a normal situation of care, and a relationship between an investigator and a subject in a trial. In a normal situation of medical care, the doctor seeks the well-being of the individual specific person entrusted to him or to her. But in the situation of an experiment, it's not the well-being of the individual subject that is the aim. The aim is the knowledge that can possibly be gained from the trial. We hope that a specific group of patients or society as a whole will benefit from that knowledge. And we'll return to that aspect in a moment. Now, after the opening statement, the Declaration of Helsinki expands on the design of trials and on the topic of autonomy. It states that medical research involving human subjects must conform to generally accepted scientific principles. Simply said, a faulty protocol can never produce the answers to the questions the investigator is looking for. And the soundness of the research protocol should be assessed by an independent committee. And it can never be the case that an investigator says, well, all my subjects volunteered. They knew the risks, so why worry? The responsibility for the well-being of the subject is always the responsibility of the researcher. And in the end, the declaration states that the integrity of the person, the privacy, the confidentiality of the patient's information and free choice have to be respected. Last but not least, it is said that professionals in healthcare should not cooperate with people who do not comply with these regulations. And journals should not publicize articles that do not comply with these regulations. Thus we enter the period, the era of evidence-based medicine. On the basis of Nuremberg, and Helsinki standards and protocols are being developed, and the randomized controlled trial comes into being. Now, you've been introduced to the ins and outs of that by Marcou, so I won't go into detail here. I only show you a slide, a recent slide about the stages of medicine development again, and I only want to say a few things about phase 3 trials. These studies are often designed to compare the study medication with the standard treatment, and the information they provide is gained from an experiment with a specific study population, which usually is taken as a sample from a group of patients who suffer from a certain disease. It clearly shows again that the position of the subject in a trial is very different from that of an individual patient who is being treated in the situation of normal care. For it is very well possible that a large number of participants in a trial will not individually benefit from taking part. Think only of the subjects in the placebo group. Or think of the subjects in the group that receives a standard treatment which is considered to be inferior, much inferior to the new study medication. Nevertheless, the experiment as a whole gives us a lot of information that is to the benefit of all patients who suffer from that disease or that ailment. So phase 3 studies are very important. Now, standardization, development of protocols, codes of conduct, it's all there in the 60s and in the 70s. But still, it's the individual researchers and sponsors' responsibility to work according to those codes of conduct and protocols. And it turns out that the proposed self-regulation by investigators and industries doesn't always work out as expected. Some sorts of wrongs are not easily banned. This is Henry Beecher. And in 1966, he calls attention to the fact that this self-regulation isn't working well. He publishes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine called Ethics and Clinical Research. If you look it up in this issue, it's in the back of the issue. It's 18 pages of small print. It doesn't appeal to you, it doesn't invite you to read it, but if you go through it, it's like a horror story. Because he identifies about 18 trials going on at that moment, not complying with the Helsinki Declaration, trials in which even people have died, he claims. Now that caused another uproar again. Remember, Tuskegee, even after publishing this article, was still going on for 6 years. Now, authorities around the world, in the US, Europe, Japan, they all then come with regulations, finally. In the US, we've got the Belmont Report. It's a direct consequence of Tuskegee. It's published in 1979. The United States, Europe, and Japan together come with the Declaration of Good Clinical Practice you've heard about, 1996, ever since updated. And the Council of Europe adds to this a number of directives and guidelines concerning drug development, 2003, 2005, and the last one in June 2014. And all these laws and all these regulations form the foundation of the assessment by review boards. Nowadays, there's consensus that medical research involving humans is needed if medical science is to progress and if society is to benefit from that progress. But there's also consensus that the subjects in these trials have rights, and these rights have to be protected. Therefore, investigators will have to weigh potential risks for the subjects against the benefit for medical science and society. They have to assess the famous risk-benefit ratio. They'll have to compromise. And ethical review boards have to decide whether they see the compromise reached by the investigators as acceptable. Now, which principles guide a review board in this assessment? Let's look at a few of them. These are the 4 guiding principles in Western medical ethics. They're called the Georgetown Mantra, because a number of medical ethicists at the University of Georgetown came to the conclusion that this could be a concise summing up of the principles that guide our thinking. You know, Western society, of course, is very pluriform. Many ways of life, many religions, many worldviews, many value systems live together in our countries. But still there are some values that can be seen as common denominators which, as it were, identify Western ethics. Agreed, it's a bit a truncated ethics. There's much to be said about that, but it's for another time. But it's quite practical. You know, doctors and nurses are practical people, though they like that. Most people living in the Western Hemisphere would underwrite these principles. You have to respect everybody else's autonomy. You have to act always in the best interest of someone else. And you have to do as little harm as possible. And you should act fairly by all men. A few remarks on these principles. Now, the principle of beneficence and non-maleficence are clearly to be identified as coming from the Hippocratic tradition. And they lead to questions like, who benefits from an experiment? And what is the risk-benefit ratio? The principle of autonomy has its roots in the tradition of enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. It's usually interpreted by the metaphor of a shield. I use my autonomy as a shield against your interference. You are not going to tell me how to live. You are not going to decide what is going to happen to me. It's my decision, and it has to be a well-informed decision. So this leads to other principles involved, like absence of force and the obtaining of informed consent. Let's take a closer look at beneficence. Who benefits from a medical trial involving human subjects? In whose interest is it? Generally, it's in the interest of a particular group of patients or society as a whole. It's not so much in the interest of the individual participant. I've already mentioned twice the fact that medical research involving humans aims at gaining generalized knowledge. It intends to enlarge our knowledge of medicine. Therefore, it is carried out in the interest of society as a whole. This means that being subject in an experiment is completely different from being a patient in the being taken care of by, for instance, a general practitioner. Physicians go a long way to assure the best treatment for their patients, and investigators should go a long way to keep the risks for a subject in a trial at minimum. But their primary aim remains the knowledge that can be gained from the trial. Now, it may be that subjects in a trial benefit from the experiment, but that is not what the experiment is carried out for. Sounds strange, but that's the way it is. When assessing the value of an experiment, review boards therefore have to keep this very much in mind. The experiment may be valuable, it adds to our knowledge, even if the subjects do not directly benefit from it. Now, important in thinking through the principle of beneficence is the distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic experiments. And that distinction helps us to understand that the subject may not benefit from a trial at all, but that the trial nevertheless may be important and worthwhile. For instance, a phase 1 trial involving a new type of chemotherapy may not at all have any beneficial effect on the subject on whom it is tested, usually a healthy volunteer. But it is very important that we gain knowledge about toxicity and safety, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics. So this trial has to be called non-therapeutical, but still it's utterly useful and necessary. A phase 3 trial with the same chemotherapy may have a beneficial effect on the participants. We assume that this chemotherapy is effective, hopefully even more effective than other therapies we already use. Our aim is to find out exactly if that is the case. So this trial also has to be called therapeutical. We even call it therapeutical if there is a control group that receives placebo or the standard treatment. That's a bit awkward. Because of the design, there's a group of subjects in the trial that surely will not benefit from it, and still we call it a therapeutical trial. Now, to make things even more complicated, it is not always easy to categorize a trial. For instance, a lot of research into medication for Alzheimer's disease doesn't do much therapeutical good to the subjects. But it helps us to gain knowledge about the direction in which helpful theories might be developed. So in the long run, the group of Alzheimer patients as a whole will benefit from these experiments. And some ethicists propose to call this type of experiment a group-indicated experiment. And then last but not least, there are the so-called experimental treatments. A physician may have a hunch. He may want to try out on one of his patients medication simply because he thinks a radically new approach might do some good. In fact, this is not really an experiment because there's no protocol, there's no methodical approach, but it's still sometimes publicized like, as Marco told you, a case report or anecdotal knowledge, anecdotal evidence. Altogether, this brings us to this sliding scale of experimental treatment, which aims at therapeutic effect. There it is. Therapeutical experiment, experimental treatment, which aims at the therapeutic effect on the individual patient, which is very clear. No experimental conditions, no protocol, strictly spoken, it is not an experiment. Your doctor just tries out something. Then the therapeutic experiment, which aims at an effect on the included human subjects, phase 3 trials, for example. And then there's the group-indicated experiment, no direct therapeutic effect, and the non-therapeutic experiment, with no therapeutic effect on the included human subjects, but very important, like phase 1 trials. Now, the fact is that most trials are not designed to benefit the participants, but to gain that generalized knowledge. And that has its problems when it comes to giving information and asking informed consent. For the obligation to give full information to the subject leads to the question what to say about possible benefits. It's difficult to recruit people if you have to say, well, it might be, actually, we think there's no benefit at all for you in this trial. So we very often see in our review boards that investigators then come up with all kinds of sentences which are very cryptic and which are promising something for the future or which are appealing to the goodwill of people to contribute to the progress of science and so on and so on. And it's a bit woolly. And before you know it, you get into, well, I wouldn't say misinformation, but still when people are very desperate and they hope that something is being done for them, and they think that this trial is only being offered to them because, of course, it will do them some good, they might be misinformed in this way that they think that this trial will surely, in every aspect, benefit them. That's what we call the therapeutical misconception. They asked me to participate because this trial is made to help people like me. Ergo, to make me benefit. But if you're in the placebo group, you won't benefit. And if it's a phase 2 trial, you might possibly benefit. If you're in a phase 3 trial even, you might possibly benefit, but we are not sure because that's exactly what we want to find out by conducting the trial. So we cannot promise anything. It's a difficult thing, but it's very important to be clear about that. Now matters get even worse. And in rare diseases, that's very often the case when a patient is recruited for a trial by his or her own physician. Consider the possibility that a patient fits neatly into a trial design his physician knows about. It may even be that the physician himself is the investigator. And consider now the possibility that this physician proposes the patient to take part in it. Now, a patient trusts his or her doctor. We hope. And we're not far away then from the situation in which you come to think naturally that because it is being proposed to you, it's also seen as the best way of treatment. Why would my doctor otherwise ask me? And he's such a nice guy. He's done so many things for us. I can't say no. I can't possibly say no. That wouldn't be fair, would it? We have this relationship of mutual trust for years now. I have to say yes. Now that's dangerous. That's potentially dangerous. Research has shown us that most patients filter the information given to them. Usually the most promising and positive elements are taken in, negative elements drop out. Clarity, honesty about possible benefits are absolutely necessary. It's essential to check if potential subjects really understand what the trial they're about to participate in means to them in terms of benefits and risks. Now, the term risks have fallen, which brings us to the principle of maleficence. And one of the key tasks of a review board is to assess the risk-benefit ratio of a trial. Now, to start with, it will be clear that the risk-benefit ratio is unfavorable when the study design is unsound. A study that in whatever way is unsound can never answer the questions it is designed to answer. Subjects then are put at risk or have to endure inconveniences for nothing. Now, research can be unsound in many ways. It can be dangerous in such a way as to damage the included human subjects. Think about Walter Reed. Risk is far too high. It can be methodically unsound. The design of the experiment makes it impossible to find the answer to the main hypothesis. So methodologically or statistically, things can be very much wrong. And I can tell you from experience, that's very often the case. There's hardly any protocol passing our eyes that is not being amended by the review board. And very often it's because of the endpoints not being clearly formulated or the design not being able to produce answers to the hypothesis is very often the case. Sometimes we even advise the investigator to withdraw the study and completely rewrite it. So this is not just incidents or something. This is happening almost with every protocol, especially the statistics. Well, you're fortunate. You're the first summer school group who's not getting the lecture in statistics. And you're unfortunate because if you would have had that lecture in statistics, you would be just as puzzled as I am. And then you would know that it's very good that you have a statistician on a review board and people who know everything about methodology, because investigators themselves very often mix up things. So it's a very difficult part of conducting a trial, statistics. So it's not so strange that we have to amend a lot of these protocols or add to them. Now, it might also be that there's no qualified personnel. You might think that's strange. Investigators, of course, know what they're doing, don't they? That might be, but think about surgery. We are going to compare two treatments, two ways of carrying out an operation. And we do that in 5 centers. Now, let's see if all of the doctors involved are just as experienced. It might be that in Center A, there's a doctor who performs this operation 100 times a year. But it might also be that in Center B, there's a doctor who has only performed it 10 times. Then we would say, that's not good. You need to have surgeons you can compare with each other. They have to have the same amount of experience. So it's not always at face value the case that personnel is qualified. Then the logistics is a point. Do you have enough patients? If you say you expect to include about 200 patients in a span of 2 years, but you get only 10 patients a year, you can never include 200 patients. So you can't conduct a trial. And of course, very often we look at the preliminary investigations, laboratory research, animal research, and the study of literature. And very often that's, a hypothesis is sometimes based on only one article. So we'd ask, should you rather change this study into a pilot study to find out the basics of your hypothesis? So there are many reasons why design can be flawed. Now, even if the design is found to be all right, that's not sufficient reason to approve of a trial, because it also has to be reasonable to conduct it. If it's designed to find out something we already know, it's not reasonable, is it? And if the knowledge can be gained in another way, why subject people to such a trial? Now, if the experiment is of sound design and it's considered reasonable, the next question comes into focus. What are the risks? What's the burden? What are the inconveniences to the subjects? Are they acceptable given the value of the experiment? Now, a few words about risks. There are several sorts of risks. You've got, of course, that's what we always think of first, the physical risks, the side effects, the interference with other treatments. The possibility that you have to stop your standard treatment and go on placebo for a number of months. Review boards can, according to their evaluation of the risks, ask investigators to change the in- and exclusion criteria to minimize risks to specific groups. They can also ask for better safety monitoring procedures, interim analyses. Look at the probiotic study. There was a safety monitoring board, but still that's no guarantee, as we've learned now. They can ask for rescue medication when pain gets too much for a patient in the placebo group, for example. There are psychological risks, like some medication could cause depression or even suicide. There could be unexpected findings. In genetic trials, you could have an unexpected finding which you have to communicate. That could be a psychological burden to the participants. There may be social risks. Genetic information may be stigmatizing. We don't want it to be stigmatizing, but unfortunately, people do stigmatize. There may be economic consequences, hospitalizing, insurance problems. Once you know you have this genetic defect, you have to tell your insurance company because you have to be honest. Perhaps your premium will go up. How a review board weighs these risks will depend on the situation. For example, one might argue that it is no problem to give a new chemotherapy which has a lot of side effects to a group of lung cancer patients who have no other remedies left. It might do them some good. But on the other hand, one might just as well argue it's absolutely not done to give them that new chemotherapy, for the side effects would ruin whatever time they've left. So it's not easy to decide whether a trial should be conducted or not. A few words about burdens and inconveniences, which are very often forgotten. Investigators are not really looking at those too much. What's the investment of time? How many hours will I be subject in this trial? And what's the length of the inclusion period? For example, think about filling out a diary every week, but having to do that for 5 years. That's quite a burden. How many hospital visits will I make? Are they out clinic or will I be hospitalized? Are there any rules of conduct? Will this trial influence my daily rhythm and my diet? What kind of medication do I have to take and in which way? Do I have to keep a diary? Do I have to make difficult choices? For example, in genetics, if something is found out and the investigator says, well, perhaps you should ask the rest of your family also to fill out this form. That's not easy. We have to think through all these consequences when we look at a protocol. And making up the balance between benefit and risk is not only done by us, of course, it's also done by the potential subjects themselves, you as patients. But to be able to do so, you need to have full information, and that brings us to the principle of respect for autonomy. Now, before looking into that, allow me to make what I see as an important remark on the task of a review board. Now, the sole task of a review board is to answer the question, is it justified to present this trial protocol to a potential subject, asking him or her to participate in it? We, as a review board, are not supposed to facilitate investigators. We are not there to further medical research. And I make this remark because the many members of our board are themselves involved in research. That means that when they see a beautiful protocol, they sometimes feel very sorry having to amend it, or even having to say this is something we can't do, because they like research and they like this typical form of research so much. So they're tending to amend it or to give advice or to change it. And that's not a bad thing in itself, but it's not our main task. Our main task is to protect very vulnerable human beings who are being asked to take part in trials. Now, respect for a subject's autonomy in the first place dictates that this choice to participate in a trial must be a free choice. No force, no coercion. And I already mentioned the therapeutical misconception as a possible danger. In a relation of mutual trust, such as between a patient and a doctor, the influence of the way the doctor speaks about participating in a trial is not to be underestimated. There's always the risk of persuasive speech. And this again brings up the question if it is wise if investigators themselves recruit their own patients. Other dangers are the impression the subject might have that a refusal to participate or the decision to drop out halfway might have a negative influence on the relationship with his physician and on further treatment of the illness. And then there's the matter of rewards. They can be used to persuade people to do things that are not good for them. Look at the Tuskegee trial. Free medical care. Enroll, free medical care. I only want to remark here that the principle of fairness is of importance in these matters, as some groups simply are more vulnerable and susceptible to the influence of coercion by reward than others. And it brings a bias to your trial. If you enroll a lot of poor people because you're giving them a financial reward, and they like that, you'll have a larger strata from that social group than from other groups, and it might influence the external validity of your trial. Now, let us look at the matter of full information. We'll go quickly through it because you can all read about that in the Declaration of Helsinki. 5 minutes more. Okay. Legislation in the Western world has expanded on the Helsinki Declaration. So patient information forms always must give information on the aim of the experiment, the reason why you as a patient are being asked to participate, the importance of the experiment, the obligations of the subject, the burden being laid on the subject, the risk involved, any measures taken to contain that risk, compensation in money, insurance, and not just insurance, liability insurance for the investigator, but insurance for you as a participant. The confidentiality of the collected data, the right to refuse without repercussions on subject treatment, the right to withdraw at any time without giving an explanation. That's interesting. Because investigators always want to know why you drop out. Was it too heavy? Did it do things to you? Were there side effects I don't know of? So they want to ask you why. And of course it's helpful if you're willing to give that information. But if there are reasons you don't want to explain, you don't have to. Always keep that in mind. You don't have to. Sometimes the patient information form suggests that you have to make a last visit in which you explain why you drop out. You don't. So, then you have to know, of course, the identity of the investigator and how to reach him or her, the opportunity to ask questions and to consult an independent physician. So you should be able to get information about this trial from someone who is not involved in it. And then you have to have the opportunity to consult your family, acquaintances, or your general practitioner. Now, because of the fact that all this has to be in the patient information form, your role as patient advocates is very important. We always have 1 or 2 patients on our board, and they scrutinize these information forms. Is this language understandable? Are there many technical terms? Are there acronyms or jargon or abbreviations you can't understand? Is the information too long? Do they expand on the risks in a way that is understandable? Because you can sum up all the risks, but it will only make you nervous. You also have to assess the possibility that one of these side effects will hurt you. Some of them will be common. Some of them will be utterly rare. So there has to be background information. And patient advocates very often amend patient information forms on that point. Now, a moot point is how to complete the information has to be. We've seen information forms of 90 pages, knowing that nobody is going to read those through. But 2 pages, that's not much, is it? Must be a very simple story. So that's a complicated thing. Now, of course, research with legally incapable persons, not being able to give consent is very difficult other issue. I can only go very shortly through a few points here, additional points being added to the caveats that are already in place when it comes to giving information. All subjects have to directly benefit from the experiment, as usually said in the European countries. Burdens and risks must be minimized. Think about groups like mentally handicapped or children here in this case. Prior to inclusion, a procedure must be agreed upon to determine expressions of refusal from the side of the participants. And subjects must be represented by a next of kin who gives written consent. Now, some people say this is too strict. If we comply with this, we won't get any further in some patient groups like Alzheimer patients or children. So we should be a bit more permissive on this. Now that's a debate, and that's a very important debate. Most certainly in rare diseases it is. And in every member state of the EU it's a different debate, I can tell you. Well, for reasons of time, I will give you the next slides to read at home. I just finished with my end remarks. I think we'll find them there, that assessment of trials will always remain necessary. We've got regulations, we've got laws, we've got protocols, we've got standard operating procedures. I don't know what all we've got. But as long as the question, we are doing this or that, but is this or that good, makes sense, there's reason for an ethical debate. And that will be forever, I can assure you, because we're now going into areas which are more and more black boxes, like Marco told you. And these black boxes contain a lot of dangers and unknowns. So it's always very important before you get into a trial to think through what might happen and if we can minimize risks and burdens. Well, you might say review boards are hampering and their procedures are hampering and they take time, they're time consuming, and they should speed up procedures a bit more. But I think the important thing is that we are trying to comply with the Helsinki Declaration, as it says, the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge. But that goal can never prevail over the rights and interests of individual subjects. And that's what we are there for, to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Maybe I would suggest that we keep the question for this afternoon. We have a full session of 1 hour for question and answer.
We'll save them for the coffee break, for the lunch, and for this afternoon.
Okay, yep. Thank you very much. So just practical information. Now we have 30 minutes of coffee break. And then there is another small group session around marketing authorization, basically the difference that happened with the clinical research in the development phase, and then when you end up with a product on the market. So you will have the same group, the flip chart is still downstairs, the same group, the same room and the same facilitator than this morning. And then we reconvene here 1 hour after for a session from Patrick Salmon, who has just arrived this morning, on the marketing authorization, the different type of marketing authorization that you have. And yeah, so I let Nancy explain you more.
Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of a rundown on the social event.